Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Welcome to the Antognazza lecture, which is the annual lecture of the British Society for the History of Philosophy. My name is Susan James, and I'm the Society's current chair. It's a huge privilege to be able to hold our annual lecture here in this resonant philosophical venue. So I'd like to thank, first of all, the Lit and Phil, and then our colleague Rachel Wiseman, who organised for us to be here. And, of course, I'd like to thank all of you for coming. The British Society of the History of Philosophy was founded in 1978, and it is just what it says on the tin. It promotes all kinds of history of philosophy to academic and to more general audiences. And we do this in various ways, by putting on lectures and conferences, by publishing lesser-known works of philosophy to make them as accessible as possible, and by funding students and scholars. We also have a journal, the British Journal of the History of Philosophy, which really leads the field by publishing articles and symposia on a completely global range of philosophers and topics and traditions. We're always keen to increase the range of our activities and our membership. So if you'd like to join us, well then please do. Just go to the Society's website and look for the button that says join, or alternatively catch one of us after the lecture. But this evening, the Antognazza lecture is named for the great Leibniz scholar Rosa Antognazza, and it's our way of celebrating her inspiring contributions both to the history of philosophy and to this society. This year, we're very fortunate to have as our speaker another inspiring historian of philosophy, Sandrine Bergès. Sandrine is a professor of philosophy in Bilkent in Turkey, and at the same time, a British Academy Global Professor at the University of York. She's famous for her prolific work on women philosophers, and she's one of the people who's done most, not only to integrate women into what used to be an almost exclusively male canon, but also to explore the radical philosophical aspects of women's lives. Her work, for example, includes work on the philosophical questions that arise out of women's radicalism and out of the relationship between women and the home. So to appreciate the full range of Sandrine's activities, I suggest you look at her website, which is enchantingly illustrated. She does this herself. But for now, let me just give you a sense, or try to give you a sense, of the breadth of her work by mentioning some of the books she's published. There was Plato on Virtue and the Law in 2012, A Feminist Perspective on Virtue Ethics in 2015, and most recently, Liberty in Their Names, The Women Philosophers of the French Revolution. Sandrine is also a major expert on Mary Wollstonecraft. She's edited or co-edited 3 important collections of essays on Wollstonecraft's life and ideas. And she's also the translator of an English edition of a set of letters by the French philosopher Sophie de Grouchy, which are about Adam Smith. So that's just a little bit of the backstory. But today Sandrine's going to talk about yet another woman philosopher, and one with strong local associations, Mary Astell. So it's a great pleasure to invite her to give the Antognazza lecture under the title, Who is a Slave and Who Should Be Freed? Astell, Marriage, and Chattel Slavery. So please welcome Sandrine.
Thank you so much, Sue, for this introduction. It's a huge honor to be here, to be giving this lecture, but also to be talking about Astell in Newcastle, the city where she was born and educated and where she spent the first 21 years of her life. I'm going to be talking about Astell's work centering around a very famous passage which is part of the preface of the third edition to her reflections on marriage. And in this passage, which is up here, Mary Astell asks, if all men are born free, how is it that all women are born slaves? As they must be if the being subjected to the inconstant, uncertain, arbitrary will of men be the perfect condition of slavery. And if the essence of freedom consists, as our masters say it does, in having a standing rule to live by. And why is slavery so much condemned and strove against in one case and so highly applauded and held so necessary and so sacred in another? So this famous passage, which is taking to task Republicans and Whigs who opposed absolute monarchy in England, but did not oppose the tyranny of men over women, is part of a preface rather than an introduction or a chapter. So we should probably read it as being suggestive of something rather than outlining arguments. But what it does very strongly suggest is that Astell thinks of marriage as slavery and of married women as enslaved. So while there are excellent papers out there that try to puzzle this passage out, I think that one way in which these questions can be framed is mostly missing from the debate. So here I want to note that there's an exception, a forthcoming paper by Mary Jo MacDonald, which you should look out for. So that way of framing the problem is to ask how Astell's views and arguments fit with the problem of Atlantic slavery. And this is what I want to focus on here. So one thing that is striking about Astell's project is that she freely uses the concept of slavery to describe married women's condition, but she has nothing to say about chattel slavery. So she was clearly cognizant of the slave trade. I'm going to show this in a bit. And she was aware of at least some of the many cruelties that it involved. And yet she's happy to use slavery at best as a metaphor, and at worst only considering it a problem for white people. Now, if that's so, it would seem that her moral and social philosophical project is limited to understanding the oppression of women who are most like her, but she has no interest in expanding it to distant others. This is a bit of a blow to those who were introduced to her as the first English feminist. For what sort of feminism is it that only cares about the white and the rich? So this is obviously a rhetorical question. We call it white feminism. Okay. So I want to argue that Astell's failure to discuss transatlantic slavery is a sign that she is not, in fact, concerned with emancipation at all, whether of white married women or chattel slaves. Instead, she's interested in ameliorating the condition of white women while they're subordinated to their husbands. In essence, she's very much like early and some late critics of transatlantic slavery who did not ask for abolition of slavery, but merely amelioration of the treatment of the enslaved. Right, except that in Astell's case, she shows no particular interest in the plight of chattel slaves, men or women. So here's my plan. So I want to show that Astell knew something, quite a lot, in fact, about chattel slavery, and that she benefited from it. Then I want to ask what the implication of Astell's not taking chattel slavery into account has for the view that she's defending a Republican or Lockean account of freedom. And then I want to engage with another interpretation of the passage that I quoted earlier, and ask whether Astell in fact defends a type of freedom of the mind that does not preclude bodily slavery. Right? So you can be bodily enslaved but free in the mind. So this would allow for her view to be extended to chattel slavery in principle. But by looking both at some cases of marital hardship and most cases of chattel slavery, it becomes obvious that it's unlikely that one could achieve freedom of the mind without some bodily autonomy. And from all this, I draw the conclusion that her emphasis on education, being the cure to slavery in marriage, is a proposal for amelioration, not for liberation. Okay, so let's start then with Astell's knowledge and involvement of transatlantic slavery. So the Restoration period, Astell was born in 1666, 6 years after the end of Cromwell's Commonwealth and the restitution of monarchy, and the whole of the 18th century in Britain, she lived for some of it, a little bit of it, were dominated by the slave trade. People talked about it, suffered or benefited from it, and they witnessed it firsthand as there were significant numbers of enslaved and a few free black people in London. Black people were not hidden away in the colonies. They walked the streets white people walked, they lived in white people's houses or next door to them. If there were servants, free or enslaved, they opened the doors to visitors and brought them refreshments. They ran errands, carried messages. They attended the same churches, shopped at the same markets. Mary Astell, a Londoner for most of her life, would therefore have been aware of the omnipresence of the enslaved sharing the world that she lived in. If Astell read newspapers or talked with people who did, she would also have known of adverts for runaway slaves. These adverts were inaugurated in the English press during the Restoration period and played an important role in an important part in the advent of newspaper advertising. Many of the freedom seekers reported in the ads came from the City of London, but also from Westminster and Chelsea, where Astell lived. From these advertisements, if from nothing else, Astell would have understood that black people were considered property to be caught and returned to their masters. Nor would she have been spared knowledge of the violent nature of slavery. Some freedom seekers were described in the ads as wearing a metal collar around their necks, much like this one here, or having marks on their bodies, brands and scars, some of them inflicted on them by their masters. So, enslaved men and women were also part of court cases, and this was the case of one Catherine Oka, a woman who'd been enslaved in Barbados and then brought to England by Robert Rich and his wife. Now, Robert Rich decided to go back to Barbados and to leave Catherine behind during that period, but before he left, he tortured her and then threw her out in the street and forbade her from seeking employment anywhere else. Basically told all his friends, she's out of limits, do not give her work. So she was left to starve. She ended up in a debtor's jail, the poultry counter. Here's a picture of it here. And here's a report from her court case, which I'm not going to read out because it's quite long. But basically, it was decided in her favor that she would be able to work until Robert Rich came back from Barbados. Right? And then he could do whatever he wanted with her because she was still his property. So we don't know what happened to her. We don't know whether she went back to Barbados, whether she died in London, found freedom before Rich came back. Any of this could have happened. There is no trace of her aside from this. Although her case was probably not reported to press because that wasn't done then, it was neither unusual nor hidden from sight. The poultry counter, where she was imprisoned, was known for holding Jewish and black inmates. And having a slave or an ex-slave thrown in jail was a very common way of preventing them from obtaining or enjoying their freedom. So it wasn't an isolated case. It wasn't unknown for these things to happen. All right, so chattel slavery was everywhere. Astell looked. So why doesn't she write about it when she writes about slavery, right? Well, her attitude is perhaps not that unusual. How many moral or political philosophers write about the homeless people they walk past every day on their way to the office? But it becomes harder to ignore injustice when it affects people we know. If a member of our family, friends circle, or workplace regularly behaves in ways that are racist, sexist, homo, or transphobic, we pause and ask ourselves why that is and what might be done to persuade them to think otherwise, or at least to stop behaving in ways harmful to others. Now, Astell was in such a situation. Several of her close friends and patrons benefited from the slave trade, and this affected her own career choices. The best-known case was that of Catherine Jones, who was Astell's close friend, her patron, and also a host during the final years of her life. So we know that Jones had slaves in her household. Catherine and her sister Frances were painted by Jan van der Vaart, together with a young black child in livery, so a portrait a little bit like the one that I showed at the beginning, but not that one. And the child is holding up a heavy bowl of fruit to them. Now the painting was engraved and became a very popular mezzotint print, so it was well known as well. And it was hanging in the house where Astell lived. So we don't know who the child portrait was. We don't know what happened to him once he grew too old to serve as a pet, but we may suspect that nothing good did happen. It was fairly common for such children to be sent back to colonies and forced to work on a plantation after they grew too old to be pets. Now, Mary Astell relied on her patrons more than she relied on the sales of her books to live and to further her projects. And this is where we find truly unsavory evidence. So while Astell was probably not implicated financially in the slave trade herself, her educational projects were. The school for girls that she founded near Chelsea Hospital was financed by Catherine Jones, Elizabeth Hastings, and Elizabeth Hutchison. The evidence linking Jones to slave trade, the portrait with a black child, is the least damning. Hutchison and Hastings' involvement with the slave trade was more concerning. Hutchison's first husband, Robert Stewart, had been a plantation owner and a staunch defender of the Royal African Company, which operated the slave trade for Virginia and the West Indies. This is their symbol. It's very, very likely that some of the money that she took from that first marriage went to fund Astell's project. Hastings' involvement is even more significant than Hutchison's because it's direct. Elizabeth Hastings was a stockholder for the Royal African Company. She contributed £200 a year to Chelsea School, which corresponded roughly to her annual income from the Royal African Company. Hastings was also a supporter of Astell's first educational project, which came to nothing, the School for Women, that she described in a serious proposal. Before the project was abandoned, Astell received pledges from friends and patrons towards building the school. And one of the most important pledges came almost certainly from Hastings, £10,000. Right, so Astell may not have been privy to Hastings' investments. She would almost certainly have known about Hutchison's first marriage. And whether she was fully conscious of it or not, Astell's projects were heavily dependent on the wealth of people who profited from the transatlantic slave trade, who supported it financially by investing in it. All right, so with all this in mind, now let's turn back to what's happening in that little passage, right? If we take Astell's rebuke of the Republicans in her preface straightforwardly, then we take her to mean that women, just like men, should be free, right? Those naughty Republicans are claiming freedom for themselves, they're forgetting about the women. That's how we can read her as. And then what we can read in what she says subsequently is that it's part of a program to achieve freedom for women, much like the one Mary Wollstonecraft proposed a few decades later. Right? It's to do with education. If we educate women, then eventually we'll achieve equality. But if we try to read Astell like Wollstonecraft, we come out disappointed because all she recommends is that women should accept their lot but be educated. Now, as a 17th century Tory, which she was, there were not a lot of avenues open to her to explore liberty for women. Asking that women be educated before they marry and continue to educate themselves afterwards was already a radical move, especially if it followed that women would then become the educators not only of their children, but also of their husbands, which is what Astell intended. So all this would contribute indirectly towards freedom. As they become more educated, men and women will slowly progress towards a greater freedom and equality. So in this reading, Astell recommends slow emancipation, but emancipation nonetheless. Right, but I think this reading is wrong. Right. So, and let me tell you why. By using the elements she finds in the Republican and the Lockean concept of freedom. She talks about tyranny, arbitrariness, domination. Astell is able to show that these are replicated in the structures that govern family life. And that all women are unfree in the same sense as aristocratic men are. Right? Women are under the tyranny of husbands in the context of family life in the same way that men are under the tyranny of the king in the context of government. This in turn suggests that the Republicans' work is incomplete. Why stop at aristocratic men instead of extending freedom to other men and all women? So if Astell is calling out the Republicans' application of their model for freedom as incomplete because they fail to include women, then it's very obvious that her own position is also incomplete, because she fails to include chattel slaves. And because of the context I outlined in just now, it's hard to imagine that she would be oblivious to that extent, that her concern for freedom when reaching out to women would not also extend to the enslaved, that she would not even consider that the black men and women she met in the streets, at church, or in a friend's home should not be wanting their liberty in the same way that women did. Astell doesn't strike me as oblivious. Right? It would be fair to her, if one wishes still to be fair to her, to consider that maybe she did not, after all, desire to extend the demand for liberty to white women. So Astell's response to the Republicans and the Whigs and the Lockeans is to their demand for liberty for themselves is not that they're not asking for enough then, but that they're asking for too much. No one really needs to be free, she wants to say. And this seems the only reasonable explanation for her failing to take into account chattel slavery. Right. Is it, though, the only reasonable explanation? Well, there is another one. Another way of understanding Astell's moral blindness and when it comes to chattel slavery. And I derived that from Charles Mills. Now, Mills, in his Racial Contract, surmises that the reason social contract theorists didn't even think to include kidnapped Africans and people indigenous to colonized lands in their social contract was that they didn't regard them as fully humans. Right? And his quote, which is not here, sorry. The quote is that, and these sub-persons, and here inserts a long list of slurs, are biologically destined never to penetrate the normative right ceiling established for them below white persons. If what Mills says applies to Astell and her circle, this would explain why African slaves were not included in Astell's discussion of freedom. Just as she suspected that men failed to recognize the full humanity of their wives, she herself failed to recognize the full humanity of the enslaved. Except not. Mills' interpretation, Charles Mills' interpretation, doesn't in fact apply to Astell. We have evidence that she did consider black people to be fully human. They have the potential to become good Christians, which for her requires the ability to follow right reason. Rationality for Astell is the mark of humanity. It makes us all equal in the great chains of beings below angels and above beasts. So if black people can follow right reason, they must be fully human. And we have evidence that she does think that from a story that she tells in Christian religion of a blackamoor pirate who has captured Christians and enslaved them and is then converted to Christianity by them. So Astell is concerned with what will happen to convert the pirate once he frees his captives and returns home. She wonders whether he'll be able to live as a Christian in North Africa, or whether his faith can only survive if he moves to England and attends proper Anglican churches. The content and presentation of the pirate's dilemma clearly show that she considered him to be as human as herself. Indeed, in order to work through the dilemma, she imagines herself to be in his place, supposing, she says, I had been an African. Right, so this is it here. All right, so if Astell is not asking the Republicans to extend their call for freedom to white married women, then what is the alternative? Well, that she's telling them that freedom, as they conceive of it, is overrated and dangerous. Having to obey a king or a husband is part of the natural God-ordained state of things. So if freedom is valuable, it has to be compatible with this order. And here I want to talk about a very recent paper published by the British Journal of the Society for the History of Philosophy, and is by Samuel Rickless and Wasel. And what they propose is that Astell is saying exactly this. It's okay to be dominated by a husband or a king as long as one remains independent in one's mind. This independence is God-given, but can and should be activated through proper education, so that once married, a woman cannot be truly enslaved. Her body is under the control of her husband, but her mind remains her own. So this is what Rickless and Wasel say. Everyone is therefore free in one way, but not in another. Although she has no meaningful freedom of action and her body is enslaved by constraint, she possesses freedom of mind, a kind of freedom that no husband, however neglectful or cruel, can take away. So it's in Christian religion, again, that Astell most clearly distinguishes between bodily slavery and slavery of the mind. Subjection to our passions, she says, is of all slaveries the most grievous and ignominious, because the mind the mind itself puts on its own shameful yoke, and we are willing slaves of the vilest masters. On the other hand, to be truly free, she says, is to act according to right reason and obey the commands of the sovereign Lord of all, who has not put the liberty of his creatures in anyone's power, but in their own. Right. So slavery of the body is quite acceptable, whereas slavery of the mind is not. And in fact, a so-called master may be more of a slave than the one he supposedly controls. Astell says, whereas in other cases, our bodies are only slaves by constraints and perhaps to an honorable person, while the mind may be freer than he whose chain he wears. And then here, Mary Astell echoes the Stoic philosopher Seneca, who wrote in his moral letters the following passage. He is a slave. His soul, however, may be that of a free man. He is a slave, but should that stand in his way? Show me a man who's not a slave. One is a slave to lust, another to greed, another to ambition, and all men are slaves to fear. I will name you an ex-consul who is a slave to an old hag, a millionaire who is slave to a serving maid. I will show you youths of the noblest birth in serfdom to pantomime players. No servitude is more disgraceful than that which is self-imposed. Right, so that's Seneca, and then Astell is very much in agreement with him here. Right, a master may be enslaved to his desires, while the person whose bodily movement he commands is spiritually free. And that's what matters. Astell believes God has put us in charge of our own freedom, so that it's possible to retain it even when our body is enslaved. Retaining intellectual or spiritual freedom requires that we learn to follow right reason, which means freeing ourselves of rash judgments. And here's how it works. Right? So I call a judgment rash and precipitate. However much we spend time in making it, if we do not hold the balance even by reducing ourselves to an indifferency to either side of the question, so we're no longer solicitous whether this or that be true or good, but only that we may find what is so. Right, and following this, the Cartesian methods, because this is very Cartesian, of course, the Cartesian method she recommends for women to achieve this balance, this indifferency, requires thoroughness, intense focus, single-mindedness, and perseverance through time. Right? It's not an easy task. And while it's something that can be learned before marriage, only if she can keep up her scholarly habits will a woman be in a position to enjoy real freedom while married to a monster. And this is where Astell's proposal sticks. And it sticks in a way that she cannot have failed to be aware of. A woman married to a monster likely could not or cannot perform the sort of intellectual exercises required to engage right reason. So Astell introduced her reflections upon marriage with the story of her French divorcee neighbor, Hortense Mancini. Mancini had run away from her husband, abandoning her children in the process. She'd had multiple affairs with both men and women, and she encouraged gambling in her salon. In her memoirs, Mancini described the demands her husband made of her, ranging from enforced and repeated travel throughout France while she was heavily pregnant, so 17th century, 18th century travel, 17th century travel, not the most comfortable, sequestration, persecution of anyone she showed favor to, including servants, some of whom were mutilated, others put to death. And Mazarin was a Catholic, but it was very clear to his wife that he was not a genuine believer, and yet he demanded his wife spend long hours in prayer every day. Mancini was a rich woman with powerful friends, yet she could not, as a married woman legally bound to her husband, rely on them to protect her from her husband's abuse. She tried, so they said sorry. So she ran away. So Astell, while full of sympathy for the poor Duchess, who was married as a teenager without being asked what she wanted, still thinks that she ought to have stayed with her husband. And she believes that had young Hortense been better prepared for marriage by education, it wouldn't have been so hard on her. She might have found solace in religion and in educating her children to become good Christian men and women. But Astell knew from her neighbor's memoirs that Mancini controlled his wife's movements, her readings, and her visitors, including religious advisors. Having to protect oneself from the constant assault of a psychopath is hardly compatible with finding time to reflect and practice using right reason. So it's mere speculation whether Astell realized that her neighbor's situation showed that freedom of the mind requires some sort of bodily freedom, at least the freedom to sit down and read the books of one's choosing. But in the case of the North African parrot she writes about in Christian religion, it's obvious that she believes there is such a dependence of freedom of the mind on the body. The question asked about him was whether once he'd freed his slave, he could go back to his country and practice Christianity on his own without the benefit of a good Anglican church. Astell answers that God would not punish him for breaking a law that he had no choice but to break. But on the other hand, she says, if he truly loved God, he would give up everything in order to place himself in a position where he could worship in an Anglican church. He would abandon his country and move to England. So a married woman must not, Astell says, up and leave her husband, no matter what is at stake. So this counts as a law she cannot break. But this doesn't mean she doesn't have any responsibility for the upkeep of her freedom. The time to act is before entering the marriage. So a woman ought to research her potential husband's character thoroughly before agreeing to marry him so that she can be assured that she'll be allowed to continue living a Christian life after being married. But Astell knows that this is not always sufficient. Men, she says, know how to hide their true character from a potential wife with, she says, diverse stratagem they use to catch their prey. Right? So, let's look a bit more into this. A wife could, in fact, enter a marriage with the full expectation that her husband will support her virtuous lifestyle and then find that, on the contrary, he actively prevents it. Right, this is the story of Maria's marriage to Venables in Mary Wollstonecraft's unfinished novel, Maria or the Wrongs of Woman. Maria, serious but naive young woman, falls in love with a man who appears to encourage her charitable work. But as soon as they're married, she finds that he is a libertine and a gambler who, once he's spent all her money, tries to sell her for sex to his friends. Now, Maria escapes. She runs away because she does not think her mind will survive this life. She knows she cannot comply bodily while seeking refuge in her soul. It just won't work. Now, another woman, non-fictional, this time in fact photographed right here, who had to escape in order to preserve her inner freedom was Harriet Jacobs, the author of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which is an autobiography. Jacobs ran away after spending 7 years hidden in a garret to watch over her children until they too could be freed, rather than let her master sexually assault her. Avoiding him had already cost her more than she cared in what she saw as loss of virtue. She'd had to take a lover for protection, another slave owner, without being married to him. She did not feel that she could afford to stay and retain her spiritual freedom. So she ran. Now, if we take seriously the experience of these two women who testified that they could not preserve their moral freedom while they were enslaved, then we must cast doubt on Astell's claim that one whose body is owned by another could always protect their inner freedom. And it would be unlikely that Astell did not see that. She would have come across enough women who were obliged to make compromises with their conscience because of what their husbands required of them in ignorance or cruelty. So even if Astell hoped that in marriage women might retain a form of liberty, spiritual and intellectual, she probably did not believe that this would necessarily be the case. And if so, she probably also did not believe that it was impossible for a man to enslave a woman's mind. She did believe, nonetheless, that marriage is only permissible, not only permissible, but a good thing, so that it's right for women to choose it when they have done their homework and tried as hard as they could to improve their own mind and their own capacities, and to obtain a correct impression of their potential husband's character, the best they can. In other words, it's in principle possible that some women will not be unhappy in marriage, despite being under the arbitrary domination of their husbands. And that more still will find a way of doing their duty to God by having children and bringing them up to be good Christians. But the Stoic ideal of complete mental freedom is not really part of that picture. Right? Women can strengthen their minds as much as possible and try their best to marry a morally good man, but none of these guarantee that they will not be forced to do things contrary to right reason. All right, so where do we go from here? While Astell is sympathetic to women's plight and thinks reform is needed, she also does not necessarily think women should be fully emancipated from men. It's in the nature of things, as ordained by God, is just and fit, she says, that some people should obey others. There's a natural hierarchy within the natural world, a great chain of beings, which has God at the top and rocks at the bottom. So this is no longer something most of us believe, but it was still very commonly believed at the time she was writing, and later. So this model, which has, so it's got, God and angels and humans and I think birds and mammals, and right at the bottom you've got rocks. Within each ring, each order, that there's a hierarchy, right? And there are divisions as well. So the human level is divided into church, state, and family. And within each division, there's a hierarchy. In the family, men are at the top, women below them, and slaves or servants below still. Okay. This order has to be preserved, because without it, there is no framework in which men and women may act according to right reason. Marriage as an institution allows for the formation of families and the raising of children in a Christian manner. If the institution is threatened, then so are citizens' abilities to lead Christian lives. So we all fit into these great chains of beings as part of pieces of a puzzle, and we must stay where we are. It's very important. But Astell thinks that it doesn't mean that those below should suffer needlessly. Right? Married women in particular will both find it easier to survive marriage and serve God's purpose as breeders of Christians if they're educated. They will not escape the domination of men under that scheme, but their situation will be improved. They will have benefited from more or less spiritual freedom depending on their situation, what sort of a husband they have, but also on their education. So the most Astell is offering through education is amelioration of some married women's conditions, something to help them, if they have the time and leisure for it, take their mind off their unfortunate but necessary subordination. Now, could Astell's proposal have resonated with those who wanted to abolish slavery? Well, certainly there's no reason why she might not have applied the same reasoning to the amelioration of the condition, at least of domestic slaves, who are part of the family order. They belong to the same part of the chain, which classifies humans in family units. Those enslaved on plantations would belong to the state part of the human link of the great chain. So it would be the responsibility of the wigs that she takes on to notice them. Right? This is about state freedom, not about family freedom. But it's still possible. In any case, it's quite clear that she has no intention of extending her plea for amelioration to the enslaved. And if, as I have argued, she realizes that mental freedom requires some bodily freedom, then she may well think that it will be impossible for chattel slaves who have very little bodily freedom to enjoy any spiritual freedom. The cost of her conservatism becomes clearer. Some well-off lucky women will be in a position to retain a degree of autonomy, but anyone lower down the human chain will not. It's a stark picture, one made starker still by widening the context and including more of those who suffered from unfreedom in ways often greater than married women, as Astell discusses, the African slaves. Okay, thank you.